Batura Sar, most commonly referred to as simply Batura, is a truly massive and imposing peak located within the northwestern reaches of the Karakoram Range in Pakistan. Standing at a height of 7,795 meters at its summit, notably, Batura is the 25th highest mountain in the world, and because of its unique geographical location at the northwestern edge of the Karakoram Range, there exists no other peak to the north or west of it with a higher summit elevation. Within the mountaineering community, Batura is not a widely known or attempted peak, despite the outstanding height of its summit, as an attempt to ascend the peak is both a highly difficult and dangerous undertaking, befitting of only a few of the most dedicated and seasoned high-altitude mountaineers. In contrast to many of the other lesser-known, yet brutally difficult to ascend peaks in the Karakoram Range I've detailed in other videos on my channel thus far, Batura is not known for its incredibly steep and sharply slanted slopes, as is the case with K1, Ladyfinger Peak, or the Trango Towers. Rather, Batura is actually known for largely the opposite as Batura's true summit lies near the center of a long ridge which serves as the backbone of the Batura Muztagh. This long ridge line, known as the Batura Wall, is accessible via numerous smaller interconnected winding ridges leading up to the main stretch of the Batura Wall, with these interconnecting ridges being flanked by expansive and ever-shifting glacial fields and ice falls. The Batura Wall itself is, overall, a gently inclining ridge leading to the summit of Batura, and the main source of its reputed difficulty as well, as a 7-mile stretch of this ridgeline lies at an elevation of greater than 7,000 meters. At such elevations, the concentration of oxygen in the air is considerably lower than at sea level, which can pose the risk of life-threatening symptoms of altitude sickness in individuals not properly acclimatized to high altitudes. Without the use of supplemental oxygen, which for regular viewers of my content this will seem like a bit of a no-brainer, but amongst the caliber of mountaineers who ascend these highly difficult and dangerous summits, the use of supplemental oxygen is all but unheard of, as these are the most in-shape, purest types of mountaineers who would likely see the use of supplemental oxygen as a distraction that would take away from their overall accomplishment. Anyways, even for climbers properly acclimatized to high-altitude climbing conditions, time spent at such an elevation is an extremely taxing affair on the body, as, starved for oxygen from the air, any and all physical activity becomes a highly exerting and exhausting endeavor to partake in. Thus, traveling across long stretches of ridgeline at such elevations is a prospect that is nigh unimaginable for all but the most hardened and seasoned of high-altitude mountaineers. In April of 1959, a multinational European expedition team, led by a 28-year-old man named Martin Kuhnel, departed from Liverpool, England, bound for Pakistan on the first leg of their journey to Batura. The other members of this expedition team included a 25-year-old man named Richard Knight, a 26-year-old man named John Edwards, a 23-year-old man named Harry Stevenson, a 27-year-old man named Albert Hirschbichler, and the team's doctor, a 31-year-old man named Keith Warburton. Upon their arrival in Pakistan, the team were beset with numerous issues, including bureaucratic holdups regarding their presence in the politically fragile region, despite them obtaining permission to embark on their expedition well beforehand. Finally, after spending over 2 weeks resolving these issues, the team, along with a group of hired porters, would begin their trek towards Batura, and while on their way there, they would cross paths with a 21-year-old Pakistani man named Jamil Shurjan, who was making his way home after his recent deployment in the British Army. After some convincing from the other members of the expedition team, Jamil would apprehensively join the team, assuming the role as an extra surveyor for the team. As they approached the base of Batura, the team would face further issues, however, as only one of the group's porters spoke English and was the sole conduit between the expedition party and the local porters who spoke only Urdu. As their journey had progressed, the porters began to demand more of the team's clothing and equipment as further payment for their services. The team would reluctantly cave to their demands until they reached the site of their base camp at the foot of the northern side of Batura and promptly fired all but 3 of the porters, who they would maintain to help them fix ropes and haul gear up the lower sections of their route. The expedition team would establish their Camp 1 at an elevation of 13,000 feet and their Camp 2 at an elevation of 16,000 feet over the course of the following few weeks, acclimatizing to the high elevation as they did so. During this time, John and Jamil would also rig a series of markers within the icefall of the glacier to assist them in surveying the speed of its glacial flow, as they would not be attempting to summit the peak. In mid-June, sidelined by a days-long string of foul weather, the remaining porters would again demand more of the team's clothing and equipment as further payment for their services, which would erupt into an argument between the expedition team and the porters, and the team would ultimately fire the remaining 3 porters, stating that their increasing demands had become excessive and that, quote, they were already lavishly equipped for the heights they were expected to reach. The sudden loss of their high-altitude porters would ultimately serve as largely just an annoyance for both John and Jamil, as they were forced to help the ascent team haul gear up and through the icefall to their higher camps in their absence. However, as the ascent team had already been ferrying a majority of their equipment themselves, even with the help of the porters, their progress was not significantly slowed, and on June 23rd, the team would establish their Camp 3 at an elevation of 18,000 feet atop the glacier's icefall, and stocked it with approximately 1 month's worth of supplies to sustain the ascent team as their new advanced base camp to avoid traversing across the ever-shifting and dangerous icefall. John and Jamil would split from the ascent team after establishing that the team would establish 3 further high camps at elevations of 20,000 feet, 22,000 feet, and 24,000 feet over the next few days, and they estimated that, weather allowing, they would reach the summit and return to base camp within the span of 15 days. The weather conditions would remain clear for the next week, and on June 28th, a local hunter would visit John and Jamil at base camp and reported that earlier that morning he had spotted 2 figures with his binoculars approximately 1,500 feet below the summit, making steady progress towards it as he observed them over the course of 3 hours, which John and Jamil reasoned was likely the summit team making their push from Camp 6, with this sighting lining up with their previously stated plans. The favorable weather window would span over the course of the next 4 days. However, on July 2nd, a fearsome foul weather system would envelop and batter Batura's slopes with no signs of relenting. Despite the weather conditions, however, John and Jamil were optimistic about the team's success in reaching the summit and their ability to rejoin them back at base camp over the next few days, as they had been afforded 4 days between the sighting on the morning of June 28th and the onset of the storm on July 2nd to reach the summit and retreat a considerable distance back down its slopes. However, as the weeks passed and the storm raged on, concern began to mount, as the duo at base camp would initially become concerned when the ascent team had yet to return to base camp by July 19th. The foul weather would finally clear a week later on July 26th. However, as snow still appeared to be falling on the upper slopes of the mountain above the icefall, John and Jamil were unable to make visual contact with Camp 3 and decided to try and make their way up the icefall to investigate. Upon closer inspection, the duo found that the icefall had shifted significantly during the storm and was now an unstable, twisted mass of winding, deep crevasses, and deemed that ascending through it would be impossible with the gear that they had on hand. And so they optimistically reasoned that perhaps the ascent team were waiting for the condition of the icefall to further stabilize before descending through it, and further reasoned that it was possible that they had not fully run through all of their stocked up supplies by this point in time. John and Jamil would request that other expedition teams in the nearby area render them assistance in their search, or at the very least loan them some better gear so that they could make an attempt to ascend the icefall. Over the course of the following few days, John would acquire some equipment from a nearby Swiss expedition team, and John and Jamil would attempt to make their way up and through the icefall, encountering significant difficulties traversing the twisted mess of deep and often snow-covered crevasses, and ultimately were forced to withdraw from their attempt at an elevation of 15,000 feet, unable to reach Camp 3 and without locating any further traces of the ascent team. On August 4th, John and Jamil would pack up base camp and began their trek back towards civilization. However, on their way, they would cross paths with a German expedition team which had heard their pleas for assistance and were on the way to assist them. And so, John, Jamil, and the Germans would return to the foot of Batura to attempt to ascend through the treacherous icefall for one final attempt to try and reach Camp 3 located above it. Unfortunately, however, the Germans would encounter the same difficulties traversing the icefall that John and Jamil had, and were similarly forced to abandon their attempt at an elevation of 15,000 feet. However, the weather during the Germans' attempt to scale the icefall had been clearer, higher on the mountain slopes, and thus they were able to find a vantage point on a rock wall with a direct line of sight to Camp 3. Upon leveraging this vantage point with their binoculars, the Germans would find that where the team's Camp 3 had once stood, only a thick layer of smooth snow now remained, with all traces of the camp, as well as their 3 further high camps, seemingly having vanished into thin air during the storm. All 5 members of the ascent team were thus considered deceased, and the remnants of the search team would depart from the foot of Batura later that month on August 15th, with the ultimate fate of the ascent team's members and whether they had reached the summit successfully remaining a mystery. This first major attempt to ascend Batura would not be followed up for nearly 2 decades until the year 1976, when a German expedition team would attempt an ascent of the peak from its southern side, and on June 30th, 2 of the team's climbers, named Hubert Bleicher and Herbert Oberhofer, reached its summit successfully in triumph. Batura would be further ascended once more in 1983 by an Austrian expedition team, which was debatably followed by another ascent in 1984, the details of which are extremely sparse and therefore questionable at best. The final recorded ascent of the peak, as of the time of making this video, would occur in 1988 by an expedition team led by a man named Piotr Milotecki, who also happened to be the leader of the 1981 K1 expedition team, which completed the one and only ascent of K1's southwestern summit, which I made a video about a while back. Following the disastrous results of the 1959 expedition team, no further attempts to ascend Batura via the crevasse-riddled glaciers of its northern side have been attempted, and the peak has remained unclimbed for nearly 40 years, following the last successful summit bid in 1988. Thank you all for watching.